Fluorescent tubes overhead hummed an off-key C-sharp, vibrating right behind Arthur's retinas. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with a thumb and forefinger, trying to massage away the dull, throbbing ache that had been building since 0600. The massive lecture hall smelled intensely of industrial floor wax ozone from the aging power conduits and the sour, sharp tang of 300 terrified cadets breathing recycled air. Nobody spoke. The silence was heavy, oppressive, thick enough to choke on. It was broken only by the rhythmic, nervous tapping of Dean's combat boot against the metal strut of the chair in front of him. Arthur wanted to tell Dean to stop. He wanted to reach over and clamp a hand down on his friend's knee. But his own hands were shaking slightly, stuffed deep into the pockets of his stiff, unyielding synth canvas uniform. He didn't want anyone to see. Instructor Sullivan stood at the front podium. The man didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a piece of raw meat left too long in the sun, all jagged scar tissue, rigid posture, and a left arm constructed of matte gray prosthetics that whirred faintly when he shifted his weight. Sullivan didn't pace. He didn't yell. He just stared at the tiered rows of cadets with a gaze so flat and dead it made Arthur's stomach turn over. "You think you are ready," Sullivan said. His voice was a low rasp, destroyed by years of breathing toxic atmosphere on some god-forsaken rock. It carried perfectly through the dead acoustics of the hall. "You think because you pass the physicals, because you can disassemble a plasma carbine in under 40 seconds, that you are soldiers." Sullivan hit a key on the console. The fluorescent light snapped off. Total darkness swallowed the room for 3 agonizing seconds before the central holoprojector booted up. It kicked in with a bass-heavy thud that vibrated up through the floorboards, rattling Arthur's teeth. A beam of harsh blue-white light cut through the dark, catching thousands of drifting dust motes before hitting the projection stage. The air instantly chilled. The Academy's climate control system was designed to drop the temperature by 10 degrees during projection sessions to keep cadets awake, but it only made Arthur's joints ache. He crossed his arms, pulling his collar up as the holographic image flared into 3-dimensional life. It was not a training simulation. The footage was raw, unedited, and lacked any of the clean tactical overlays they were used to. Ash rained down on the projection stage. It wasn't clean white ash. It was a heavy, greasy gray snow mixed with pulverized concrete and biological matter. The audio kicked in a second later. It wasn't the sanitized sound of action movies. It was peaking clipped audio from a helmet microphone distorted by extreme decibel levels. Deafening rhythmic pops. Low-frequency thuds that made the air in Arthur's lungs compress. Overlapping screams that cut out abruptly into static. Arthur swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He could almost smell the burning ozone and copper tang of blood, even though it was just light and sound. On the stage, a squad of coalition heavy infantry was breaking down. They were dug into a shattered urban ruin surrounded by twisted rebar and slabs of ferrocrete. The camera perspective belonged to a soldier pinned behind a collapsed support pillar. "Watch," Sullivan commanded from the shadows. The enemy breached the perimeter. They didn't have an official name yet in the cadet manuals, just a dozen terrified nicknames. Goliaths, Rustbacks. The footage showed why. A massive shape easily 9 feet tall exploded through a brick wall like it was made of wet paper. It was a walking nightmare of chitinous armor and heavy industrial weaponry grafted directly onto pale, muscular flesh. The coalition soldiers opened fire. Brilliant streaks of superheated plasma lashed out, illuminating the dust-choked air. Some hit the Goliath. The plasma washed over its thick armor, scoring the surface, but doing nothing to slow its momentum. Arthur's jaw ached. He realized he was clenching his teeth so hard he might crack a molar. He gripped the edge of his desk, his fingernails digging uselessly into the cheap imitation wood laminate. He wasn't heroic. He wasn't feeling a surge of righteous fury or a desire to avenge the fallen. He just wanted to throw up. He wanted to stand up, walk out the heavy security doors, and never look back. This wasn't a career. This was an execution line. Next to him, Dean let out a pathetic wet sound. A whimper that got immediately drowned out by the booming audio of the projection. Dean had his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes wide and fixed on the slaughter, completely paralyzed by the sensory assault. The Goliath reached the first coalition soldier. The camera shook violently, dust smearing the lens as the giant creature swung a massive hydraulic-powered limb. The soldier didn't even have time to scream. The impact threw him 30 feet into a concrete wall, his body bending at an angle that shattered Arthur's final illusions about modern armor plating. This is the reality of the front line. Sullivan's voice drifted over the carnage calm and entirely disconnected from the horrors playing out. Your armor will not save you. Your weapons are inadequate. The enemy does not feel fear, they do not experience fatigue, and they do not take prisoners. In an overwhelming breach scenario, your only purpose is to die slowly enough to allow the artillery to target your coordinates. Arthur closed his eyes for a second, feeling a cold drop of condensation from the ceiling vents hit the back of his neck. He shivered. When he opened his eyes again, the slaughter was continuing. The squad was completely broken. 2 soldiers were running away, dropping their rifles in a blind panic. The cameraman was hyperventilating the microphone, picking up the ragged, wet sounds of his terror. It was a meat grinder, and they were just next week's meat. Dust coated the soldier's helmet camera lens, giving the hologram a gritty, artifact-heavy texture that made the violence seem even more visceral. Sullivan let the unmitigated slaughter play on loop for another solid minute. The booming thuds of the Goliath's footsteps reverberated through the lecture hall, perfectly synchronized with the erratic, panicked breathing of the cameraman. Arthur felt completely numb. The initial spike of terror had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow, cold exhaustion. He slumped back in his chair, his eyes glazing over as the focal point of the hologram shifted wildly. The cameraman was crawling backward through the rubble. His weapon abandoned his hands, dragging through thick, dark mud. "Pay attention to the tactical breakdown," Sullivan barked, pacing slowly into the edge of the blue light. Notice the complete collapse of formation, the failure to establish a secondary firing line. This is what panic does. Panic is a disease. Arthur tried to focus on Sullivan's words to pull himself out of the deep, cynical dread pooling in his gut. He forced his eyes back to the projection. The cameraman had propped himself against a jagged piece of metal. The main action, the Goliath tearing apart the last of the fleeing squad, was happening in the foreground, out of focus and chaotic. But Arthur's eyes wandered. The sheer sensory overload of the foreground violence was too much, so he instinctively looked away, searching for a static point in the hologram to rest his vision. He found one in the top left quadrant of the projection. Deep in the background, near a collapsed doorway, bathed in the amber glow of a burning transport vehicle. Arthur blinked. He leaned forward, squinting through the artificial haze of projected ash and smoke. There was a figure back there. It wasn't moving like the coalition soldiers. It wasn't sprinting in blind terror, and it wasn't huddled on the ground waiting to die. At first, Arthur thought it was a glitch in the footage, a ghost artifact rendered poorly by the Academy's aging projectors. But the camera shifted slightly as the pinned soldier adjusted his weight, and the background figure remained solid. "Look at the pacing of the enemy," Sullivan droned on, oblivious to anything but his own morbid lesson. It does not rush. It knows it has already won. Arthur didn't care about the Goliath anymore. His eyes were locked on the background. The figure was small, at least compared to the bulky armored coalition troops. It wasn't wearing standard-issue heavy plating. In fact, it barely looked armored at all. The figure was backed into the shadow of the doorway, holding perfectly still. Then the figure moved. Not a frantic jerk, but a slow, deliberate lowering of its center of gravity. "Sir," Arthur said. His voice was a dry croak. It barely carried over the audio of the projection. He cleared his throat, tasting bile, and tried again. "Instructor Sullivan." The lecture hall went dead silent, save for the thundering noise of the footage. 300 heads snapped toward Arthur. Dean looked at him like he had just pulled the pin on a live grenade. Interrupting Sullivan during a tactical demonstration was tantamount to academic suicide. Sullivan stopped pacing. The mechanical whir of his prosthetic arm ceased. He turned his scarred face toward the tiered seating, his one good eye locking on to Arthur. "Did you have an observation to share with the class, cadet?" Sullivan asked, his tone dangerously soft. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a sudden intense urge to apologize, to sink down in his chair and stare at the floor. But he couldn't look away from the tiny blurry figure in the background of the violent hologram. "Pause the playback, sir," Arthur said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "And zoom in on Sector 4, top left quadrant, near the burning transport." Sullivan's jaw tightened. For a second, Arthur was sure the instructor was going to have him dragged out of the hall. But Sullivan just grunted, turning back to the console. He slammed a heavy fist down on a key. The deafening noise of the battle cut out instantly. The screaming stopped. The Goliath froze mid-swing, a terrifying statue of violence. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, ringing in Arthur's ears. "Sector 4, Sullivan muttered, typing coordinates into the pad. The hologram warped the perspective, flying past the frozen Goliath, past the terrified cameraman, and zooming deep into the background. The projection pixelated heavily before the Academy's mainframe began rendering the enhanced resolution, filling in the missing data with terrifying clarity. The image sharpened. A collective intake of breath echoed through the lecture hall. Even Sullivan froze his hand, hovering over the console. It was a human. Arthur had only read about them in the supplemental texts. They were a relatively new addition to the coalition, considered physically fragile, lacking the dense muscle mass of the Bruxians or the natural dermal plating of the Vang. They were mostly relegated to logistics engineering and diplomatic corps. Nobody put humans on the front line. It was considered a waste of resources. But there one was. The human was covered in mud and dark, wet blood. He wasn't wearing a helmet. His face was smeared with soot, his hair matted to his forehead. He was wearing outdated, lightweight kinetic armor that looked like it had been scavenged. But it wasn't his appearance that made Arthur's breath catch. It was what he was doing. The human wasn't cowering. He was sitting on an overturned ammunition crate. In his left hand, he held a standard-issue entrenching tool, a simple sharpened metal shovel. In his right, he was calmly, methodically forcing a fresh magazine into a battered ballistic rifle. His face, frozen in high definition, didn't hold a trace of the blind panic that had broken the coalition squad. His eyes were cold, flat, and terrifyingly focused. He was staring directly past the camera, entirely ignoring the slaughter in the foreground, his gaze locked entirely on the breach point, where more Goliaths were about to pour through. He looked tired. He looked battered. But mostly, he looked like a man who had accepted his death hours ago and had simply decided to make it as expensive for the enemy as possible. Absolute silence gripped the room, stretching out until it felt brittle enough to snap. Nobody moved. 300 cadets barely drew breath, their eyes anchored to the magnified, pixelated corner of the projection stage. Arthur could hear the erratic, shallow breathing of Dean beside him, mixed with the faint, high-pitched whine of the ventilation system overhead. Sullivan did not turn to face the class. He kept his scarred profile directed at the frozen hologram, his single organic eye locked entirely on the muddy, battered figure sitting on the ammunition crate. The instructor's synthetic arm gave a low, mechanical click as his fingers flexed. "Playback normal speed, audio 40%. Sullivan ordered the computer. Noise flooded the lecture hall again, but the dampening made it sound like it was happening underwater. The terrified screams of the cameraman and the booming thuds of the Goliath in the foreground became a muffled, chaotic drone. Arthur barely noticed the main slaughter anymore. Every ounce of his attention was funneled into that blurry top-left quadrant. The human didn't leap into action. He didn't issue a war cry. He simply waited. In the foreground, the Goliath finished dismantling the last coalition soldier. It dropped a mangled piece of armor, plating into the dust, and turned its massive chitinous head. It scanned the ruined courtyard, heavy optical sensors, glowing a sickly radioactive green through the smoke. It registered the burning transport vehicle. It registered the dead. Then its sensors locked onto the shadow of the doorway. The Goliath pivoted its hydraulic joints hissing in the audio feed. It took a step toward the human. The human finally moved. He stood up from the crate, his movements incredibly stiff, almost robotic. Arthur could see a dark, wet stain spreading across the left side of the human's torso, soaking through the scavenged kinetic weave of his vest. He was already injured, badly, but he didn't clutch the wound. He raised the battered ballistic rifle and tucked the stock firmly into his shoulder. "Antique tech," somebody whispered from the back row. Arthur didn't know who it was, and he didn't care. He leaned closer, gripping the edge of his desk. Ballistic weapons were a relic. The coalition had phased them out decades ago in favor of superheated plasma and directed energy, citing logistical issues with carrying heavy physical ammunition. But as the Goliath charged, closing the distance with terrifying ground-shaking strides, the human pulled the trigger. It wasn't the clean, synthesized hiss of a plasma carbine. It was a brutal, deafening sequence of mechanical violence. Crack, crack, crack. The muzzle flash was a dirty, blinding yellow, spitting out a thick cloud of propellant smoke. Plasma washed over Goliath armor, distributing the heat across the chitinous plates. Solid slugs did not. Heavy armor-piercing, depleted uranium rounds slammed into the Goliath's chest plate. The kinetic transfer was immense. The giant creature didn't stop, but it stuttered its momentum, breaking for a fraction of a second, as the sheer physical impact of the heavy caliber rounds registered. The human didn't aim for center mass again. He adjusted his stance, dropping to one knee in the mud, and fired a 2-round burst directly at the Goliath's heavy armored knee joint. Sparks showered as the round shattered a hydraulic line. Thick black fluid sprayed across the concrete. The Goliath roared a digitized grating sound of compressed air and rage and lunged forward, swinging its massive integrated cannon arm. The human didn't try to block. He didn't try to parry. He threw himself flat into the thick, greasy mud, a split second before the cannon sheared through the doorway, obliterating the concrete frame where his head had been. Shrapnel and brick dust exploded outward, raining down over the projection. Arthur flinched in his seat, blinking against the phantom dust. When he opened his eyes, he fully expected to see the human crushed beneath the rubble. Instead, a hand covered in gray ash shot out of the debris. The human dragged himself forward, sliding through the mud on his belly, closing the distance to the Goliath, rather than retreating. He abandoned the empty ballistic rifle. His right hand snatched the sharpened entrenching tool from where he had dropped it. the Goliath temporarily unbalanced by its shattered knee, and the momentum of its own swing struggled to right itself. The human scrambled up, pressing himself directly against the Goliath's massive armored thigh. It was an impossible suicidal angle. The Goliath couldn't lower its primary weapons enough to track him. The giant creature reached down with its secondary pincer-like manipulator arm, trying to crush the nuisance at its feet. The human swung the shovel. He didn't hack blindly. He drove the sharpened edge of the steel spade directly into the glowing green optical cluster on the Goliath's lower abdomen, a secondary sensor node. Glass and delicate electronics crunched. The human didn't pull the weapon out. He used it as a lever, throwing his entire body weight against the handle, twisting the metal deep inside the creature's unarmored chassis. The Goliath spasmed violently. Its heavy manipulator arm flailed wildly the backhand, catching the human squarely in the chest. The impact was sickening. Even with the audio dampened, Arthur heard the distinct wet snap of ribs. The human was thrown backward like a discarded rag doll, flying 10 feet through the air before slamming hard into the side of the burning transport. He slid down the metal hull, leaving a thick smear of dark blood on the chassis, and crumpled into a motionless heap in the mud. The Goliath righted itself. Sparks and black fluid poured from its abdomen. It raised its cannon, aiming directly at the broken human. Arthur forgot how to breathe. His chest ached. He realized his fingernails had actually dug through the cheap laminate of his desk, splintering the synthetic wood. Then the human stirred. Ash hung suspended in the artificial light of the projection, catching the amber glow of the digital flames. The human did not bounce back to his feet. He rolled onto his side, his face contorted in an ugly, raw grimace of pure agony. He coughed a violently productive sound that sprayed bright arterial red blood into the gray mud. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like roadkill, but his hand was moving. While the Goliath charged its weapon, the mechanical whine of capacitors spooling up the human reached into the webbing of his scavenged vest. His fingers, trembling violently, pulled free a thick, heavy metallic cylinder. It wasn't a sleek coalition grenade. It was a crude, heavy demolition charge wrapped in thick adhesive tape. He didn't try to throw it. His arm was clearly broken, hanging at a sickening angle. Instead, he forced himself up onto his good elbow, spit a mouthful of blood and broken teeth into the dirt, and armed the charge with his teeth. He looked up at the towering, terrifying machine about to end his life. The human didn't scream a final curse. He just stared at it, his eyes dead dark pits of absolute venomous spite, and let the armed charge drop into the puddle of black hydraulic fluid pooling around the Goliath's shattered knee. "Pause playback," Sullivan barked. The hologram froze instantly, the Goliath glowing cannon aimed downward, the human propped on a shattered arm waiting for the blast. The silence in the lecture hall rushed back in heavy and thick. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The only sound was the ragged, rapid breathing of 300 cadets trying to process what they had just witnessed. Arthur stared at the frozen image, his mind racing, trying to categorize the human's actions. It wasn't bravery. Bravery implied a choice between fighting and fleeing. The human had bypassed the choice entirely. "Look at him," Sullivan said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp instructional edge. He walked slowly around the projection console, stepping into the edge of the blue light. He pointed a synthetic finger at the human. "What do you see, cadet?" Sullivan was looking directly at Arthur. Arthur swallowed his throat incredibly dry. He forced his fingers to uncurl from the edge of his desk. "I see a casualty, sir. He's dead." "Yes," Sullivan agreed flatly. "In 3.2 seconds from this timestamp, that demolition charge detonates. It vaporizes the Goliath's lower half and the resulting shockwave liquefies the human's internal organs. He is dead. But look closer. Look at his hands. Sullivan tapped the console. The computer zoomed in further, magnifying the human's right hand, resting in the mud near the dropped entrenching tool. The image was grainy, heavily pixelated by the extreme magnification, but the movement was undeniable. The human's hand was shaking. Not a minor tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable spasm. "He is terrified," Sullivan said softly, his words carrying a strange, heavy reverence. "His heart rate is likely approaching 200 beats per minute. His central nervous system is flooded with adrenaline toxicity. He is in agonizing physical pain. Every biological instinct in his primitive, unarmored body is screaming at him to curl into a ball and hide." Sullivan turned to face the tiered seating, his organic eye scanning the pale faces of the cadets. "You look at the coalition forces in the foreground." Sullivan continued gesturing to the mangled bodies of the heavy infantry. "They wore half-inch ablative plating. They carried weapons capable of glassing a city block. And when the line broke, they panicked. They ran. They died with their backs to the enemy because their armor gave them an illusion of safety. When that illusion shattered, their minds shattered with it." Sullivan walked back to the human standing beside the projection of the battered, bleeding figure. "Humans do not have dermal plating. They do not have redundant nervous systems. They are fragile, water-filled bags of calcium and meat." Sullivan said, his tone utterly devoid of his usual mockery. "But they possess a psychological trait that defies tactical analysis. They have the capacity to process absolute, mind-breaking terror, acknowledge their own immediate death, and then weaponize the resulting spite." Arthur stared at the shaking hand in the hologram. A cold realization began to settle deep in his gut, replacing the nausea. He wasn't looking at a hero. He was looking at a predator that had been pushed into a corner, stripped of all options, but one. "This footage wasn't recorded to show you how to fight a Goliath," Sullivan said, turning off the projector. The lecture hall plunged back into total darkness for 3 seconds before the harsh fluorescent lights flickered back on. Arthur blinked, his eyes watering against the sudden brightness. Sullivan stood at the podium, leaning heavily on his synthetic arm. He looked older, tired. "This footage," Sullivan rasped his eyes, locking onto Arthur once more, "was recorded to show you the difference between a soldier who relies on his gear and a soldier who relies on his mind. The enemy will strip your armor. They will break your weapons. They will push you into the mud and force you to look at your own death." Sullivan straightened up his voice, cracking like a whip through the silent hall. "When that happens, you do not panic. You do not run. You find a shovel. You find a rock. You find your own broken teeth, and you make them pay for every inch of ground they take." Class dismissed. Arthur didn't move. Around him, chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as cadets slowly, numbly began to gather their datapads. Dean stood up, his face still the color of old ash, and headed for the aisle without a word. Arthur stayed seated. He looked down at his own hands resting on the scarred laminate desk. They were still trembling. But for the first time since 0600, Arthur didn't want to hide them in his pockets. He just watched them shake and slowly close them into fists. Cold, recycled air hit Arthur's face the moment he crossed the lecture hall threshold. It smelled sharply of chemical pine and stale sweat, a desperate attempt by the Academy's scrubbers to mask the scent of 300 terrified bodies. The wide metallic corridors of Sector 4 were usually a chaotic bottleneck of cadets rushing to their next block, shouting over each other, shoving shoulders. Not today. Today, the procession moving toward the mess hall resembled a funeral march. Boots hit the grated floor plating in a dull, irregular rhythm. Nobody spoke. The heavy, oppressive silence from Sullivan's projection stage had followed them out into the fluorescent-lit reality of the academy. Arthur walked beside Dean, his hands stuffed deep into his uniform pockets. His fingernails were still packed with synthetic wood laminate from his desk. He could feel the slight ache in his jaw from clenching his teeth for an hour straight. Beside him, Dean was breathing through his mouth in short, erratic hitches. The kid looked awful. His skin had taken on a pale, sickly yellow hue, and his eyes kept darting to the ventilation grates overhead, as if expecting a Goliath to smash through the ceiling panels at any given second. They reached the mess hall. The noise here was unavoidable, the clatter of polyglass trays, the hum of the massive nutrient dispensers, the low drone of thousands of conversations. But to Arthur, it all sounded hollow, muted. He grabbed a tray and stepped up to the dispenser. A thick gray square of soy protein hit his plate with a wet slap, followed by a dollop of neon green carbohydrate paste. It looked like industrial sealant. Usually Arthur covered it in synthetic hot sauce just to choke it down. Today, he didn't even bother grabbing a packet. He just stared at the gray mass, thinking about the heavy, greasy snow falling in the hologram. They found an empty metal bench near the back wall. Dean sat down heavily, his tray hitting the table with a loud clatter. He didn't pick up his fork. He just wrapped his arms around his torso, shivering, despite the ambient warmth of the crowded room. "I'm done," Dean whispered. His voice was fragile, brittle as spun glass. Arthur slowly looked up from his tray. "What? I'm submitting my transfer request." Dean stared at his own shaking hands. "Logistics, agriculture, sanitation, I don't care. I'm washing out of infantry." A week ago, Arthur would have argued. He would have told Dean to push through, reminded him of the prestige of the coalition vanguard, the extra rations, the promised citizenship tiers. A week ago, Arthur still believed the recruiting vids. "Okay," Arthur said softly. Dean blinked, looking up in surprise. He had clearly been expecting a fight. "You're not going to tell me I'm a coward." "No." Arthur picked up his fork, the cheap metal feeling strangely heavy in his grip. He pushed the gray protein block around his tray. "Sullivan wasn't showing us that footage to make us brave, Dean. He was showing us what happens when the armor fails. If you can't handle the idea of the mud, you shouldn't be on the line. They'll just use you as sandbags." Dean swallowed hard, looking away. "Did you see that human's face?" He muttered, his voice barely audible over the din of the mess hall. "Before he set off the charge, he didn't look sane." "He looked like he didn't have a choice," Arthur corrected. Arthur let his gaze drift away from his untouched food, scanning the massive, cavernous room. Thousands of cadets, all clad in pristine gray and blue synth canvas. All of them physically fit, genetically screened, highly trained in standard tactical doctrine. But now looking at them, Arthur didn't see an elite fighting force. He saw rows and rows of fragile, water-filled bags of calcium and meat. His eyes stopped on a corner table near the rear maintenance access doors. It was a small group, maybe 5 people wearing stained, heavy-duty coveralls instead of uniforms. They were eating quickly, hunched over their trays, largely ignoring the sea of cadets around them. Logistics crew, mechanics, pipe fitters. They were humans. Arthur stared. He had seen them around the academy before, of course. They fixed the atmospheric scrubbers, repaired the heavy loader mechs in the hangar bays, and unclogged the waste recyclers. He had never really paid attention to them. They were background noise, unremarkable. One of them, an older man with silver threading through his dark hair, laughed at something a younger woman said. He reached up to wipe his mouth with the back of a grease-stained hand. As his sleeve rode up, Arthur saw it. Thick, ropey burn tissue snaked up the man's forearm, disappearing beneath the heavy canvas of his coveralls. It was an ugly, brutal scar. The man caught Arthur looking. He didn't look away. The human's laughter died instantly, his eyes entirely flat and devoid of the warmth they had held a second prior, locked onto Arthur's across the crowded room. It wasn't a glare of intimidation. It was an assessment. Cold, clinical, the look of a creature evaluating whether the thing staring at it was a threat, a nuisance, or prey. Arthur felt a sudden icy prickle at the base of his neck. His stomach tightened. It was the exact same dead-focused stare he had seen projected in 10-foot high definition an hour ago. Arthur broke eye contact, first looking down at his tray. His heart was thumping a slightly faster rhythm against his ribs. He picked up his fork and shoved a piece of the tasteless protein block into his mouth, chewing mechanically. He tasted nothing. They weren't just mechanics. They weren't just background noise. They were walking, breathing bundles of spite waiting for the armor to break. Gravity in the secondary training bays always felt a fraction too heavy, pulling at the joints and compressing the spine. Sector 7 was an environmental simulator entirely stripped of the sterile, clean aesthetics of the rest of the academy. It smelled of wet earth copper and the sharp chemical tang of synthetic blood markers. "Drop the vests," Instructor Sullivan's voice echoed off the damp concrete walls. He stood on a raised catwalk overlooking the massive 2-acre indoor trench system. He was wearing his standard uniform, but his synthetic arm rested casually on the railing, the mechanical digits tapping a slow, agonizing beat. Arthur unbuckled his kinetic harness. The heavy, reassuring weight of the composite armor slid off his shoulders and hit the grating with a dull thud. Around him, 40 other cadets did the same. They were left in nothing but thin, unarmored black undersuits. The air in the bay was chilled, sitting just above freezing. Arthur shivered, crossing his arms, feeling incredibly naked. Dean hadn't shown up. He was already in the administrative wing filling out his transfer forms. Arthur was entirely alone. "Today's parameter is survival," Sullivan announced. He didn't use a megaphone. The acoustics of the bay carried his rasping voice perfectly. "You have no armor. You have no standard-issue energy weapons. You will be entering a simulated urban ruin currently occupied by hunter-killer drones, calibrated to Bruxian physical standards. They are faster than you. They are stronger than you. Their paint rounds are fired at a velocity that will fracture ribs and crack collarbones." A nervous ripple ran through the formation. Usually they ran these drills fully kitted, relying on their armor's internal dampeners to absorb the kinetic force of the training rounds. "Your objective is to reach the extraction zone at the far end of the trench system," Sullivan continued. "If you are hit, the marker die will lock up the joints of your undersuit. You are immobilized. You are dead. The simulation ends when you all cross the line, or when you are all dead. Enter the mud." The massive iron gates at the edge of the grating groaned open, revealing a steep, slick ramp leading down into the dark, rain-slicked trench network. Overhead, the environmental sprinklers kicked on, raining a heavy, freezing drizzle down on them. Arthur didn't hesitate. He didn't want to stand on the grating and think about it. He jogged down the ramp, his boots sinking immediately into ankle-deep freezing mud. It sucked at his heels, thick and unyielding. The smell of rotting vegetation and churned earth was overpowering. "Begin!" Sullivan's voice cracked over the PA system. Chaos erupted instantly. From the shadows of the ruined ferrocrete structures, the drones engaged. They were heavily armored quadrupeds moving with sickening speed over the uneven terrain. The heavy thud, thud, thud of their pneumatic launchers firing echoed through the trench. A cadet to Arthur's left took a round directly to the sternum. The impact sounded like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef. The cadet was thrown backward off his feet, gasping for air, as bright blue marker dye exploded across his chest. His undersuit locked rigid, trapping him in a painful, breathless arch in the freezing mud. Arthur didn't stop to help him. There was no helping the dead. He threw himself forward, sliding behind a ruined slab of concrete, as 3 heavy paint rounds shattered against the other side, showering him in sharp, stinging fragments of simulated brick. His breathing was already ragged. His lungs burned from the cold air. Without the servo assistance of his armor, every movement required exhausting physical effort. His thighs burned as he crouch-walked through the slop, trying to keep his head down. Overhead, the heavy mechanical sounds of the drones hunting echoed off the walls. Cadets were screaming, not battle cries, but genuine cries of pain as the high-velocity rounds broke skin and bruised bone. The formation had dissolved in less than 30 seconds. It was a total, unmitigated rout. Arthur rounded a corner, his boots slipping on a patch of slick clay. He stumbled, falling hard onto his knees. A shadow fell over him. Arthur looked up. A hunter-killer drone was perched on the edge of a collapsed roof directly above him. Its optical sensors glowed a sterile, unfeeling blue. The pneumatic launcher on its back swiveled down, locking directly onto Arthur's face. He was dead. He was caught out in the open, unarmored, with nowhere to dive. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. His biological instincts screamed at him to throw his hands over his face, to curl into a ball, to shut his eyes, and wait for the impact. They will push you into the mud and force you to look at your own death. Sullivan's voice echoed in his memory, drowning out the mechanical whine of the drone's launcher spooling up. Arthur didn't close his eyes. He didn't cover his face. He looked down at his trembling hands, buried up to the wrists in the freezing, stinking mud. His fingers brushed against something hard, cold. It was a piece of shattered rebar left over from the construction of the simulator, half buried in the clay. Arthur didn't think. The adrenaline toxicity flooded his system, overriding the panic with a sudden violent surge of absolute refusal. He didn't wait for the drone to fire. He screamed a raw, ugly sound that tore his throat and lunged upward. He grabbed the jagged, rust-flaked iron bar and hurled it with every ounce of strength in his unarmored, shaking body directly at the glowing blue optic sensor of the machine above him. Heavy iron met polyglass with a sickening, brittle crunch. The rebar didn't pierce the hunter-killer's armored chassis, but the sheer kinetic shock shattered the drone's primary optical casing. Sparks showered down, hissing violently as they hit the freezing mud. The machine flinched. Its damaged targeting gimbal jerked wildly to the right just as the pneumatic launcher fired. The heavy paint round missed Arthur's face by less than 3 inches. It slammed into the ferrocrete wall behind him, exploding into a cloud of sharp debris and bright blue marker dye. Shrapnel bit into Arthur's cheek, drawing hot, real blood, while a thick splash of the chemical dye caught his left shoulder. Instantly, the smart fabric of his undersuit reacted. The polymer mesh tightened with bone-crushing force, locking his left arm tightly against his torso to simulate a catastrophic injury. Pain flared a sharp electric spike that stole his breath. He had a dead limb. Arthur didn't freeze to process the pain. The drone above him was already recalibrating its mechanical joints, whirring, as it tried to compensate for the shattered optic. Arthur threw himself forward, sliding on his belly through the freezing slop. He scrambled under the lip of a collapsed floorboard, plunging into a dark, flooded crawl space beneath the ruins, just as a second paint round obliterated the ground where he had been kneeling. He lay in the shallow, freezing water, gasping. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently it made his vision pulse in time with the beats. He tasted rust and dirty rainwater. He looked at his locked left arm, useless and numb. He had survived. He hadn't used standard tactical evasion. He hadn't relied on his non-existent armor. He had thrown a piece of garbage at a 500,000 credit war machine out of sheer, unadulterated panic and spite. It was ugly, it was entirely undignified, and it had worked. Arthur forced himself to move. The crawl space was narrow, forcing him to drag himself forward, using only his right arm and his legs. The cold was beginning to seep into his bones, turning his extremities sluggish. Above him, the simulation continued. The heavy thuds of the pneumatic launchers were constant, now accompanied by the wet, breathless cries of cadets getting picked off one by one. The Vanguard was being systematically slaughtered. He emerged from the crawl space near the rusted chassis of an old industrial generator. The trench here was deep, the mud thick and churning. Huddled behind the generator were two other cadets. Miller was sitting completely rigid, his undersuit locked tight across his chest and legs. He was covered in bright blue dye, his eyes wide and staring blankly at the rain pouring from the ceiling grates. Dead. Beside him was Carter. Carter was entirely untouched by the marker dye, but he was curled into a tight fetal position, his hands clamped over his ears, sobbing openly. Arthur dragged himself up, leaning heavily against the rusted metal. His left shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. "Carter," Arthur croaked. His throat was raw from the cold air. Carter didn't look up. He just shook his head, burying his face deeper into his knees. "I can't. We're unarmed. We're dead. It's a meat grinder." Arthur felt a sudden irrational surge of anger. It wasn't the righteous anger of a soldier. It was the raw irritation of a cornered animal dealing with dead weight. He dropped to his knees, grabbing Carter by the collar of his undersuit with his one good hand. He didn't shake him gently. He slammed Carter back against the generator casing. "Look at me," Arthur hissed, his face inches from Carter's. Carter blinked, his eyes red and terrified. He looked at the mud caking Arthur's face, the streak of real blood leaking from his cheek, the utterly deadlocked left arm. "They track heat and they track movement," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of comfort. "We are wearing black undersuits. We are glowing like beacons against the ambient temperature of this trench." "So what?" Carter choked out. "We can't hide. Yes, we can." Arthur let go of Carter's collar. He reached down into the trench, digging his hand deep into the freezing heavy clay. He pulled up a massive handful of the stinking mud and slapped it directly onto Carter's chest. Carter gasped, trying to recoil from the freezing slop. "What are you doing?" "Masking our signatures," Arthur said coldly. He grabbed another handful and smeared it over his own locked shoulder. "The armor is gone. The weapons are gone. If you want to survive, you have to look like the dirt." Carter stared at him for a second, the realization slowly cutting through his panic. It wasn't a heroic strategy. It was degrading. It required them to fully surrender the sterile, disciplined image of the coalition vanguard and literally crawl in the filth. Above them, a hunter-killer drone stalked past the edge of the trench. The mechanical whir of its servos was deafening. Carter flinched, but he didn't scream. With trembling hands, he reached down into the slop, pulled up a handful of mud, and began packing it against his own neck. "Follow me," Arthur said. "Keep your head down, and if you find a rock, pick it up." Floodlights cut through the artificial rain, illuminating the extraction zone at the far end of the trench system. It was a raised ferrocrete platform, completely devoid of cover, bathed in harsh, unforgiving white light. 3 hunter-killer drones paced the perimeter. Their heavy footfalls vibrated through the muddy earth, a rhythmic, terrifying drumbeat. Arthur lay flat on his stomach at the edge of the tree line, buried entirely beneath a layer of freezing mud. Beside him, Carter and 3 other cadets who had managed to follow their trail of survival were doing the same. They looked less like a military unit and more like a mass of shallow graves. Only 5 left. Out of 40. Arthur's body was shutting down. The cold was a physical weight pressing against his chest. His locked left arm had gone completely dead, a numb anchor dragging him down. He spit a mouthful of gritty water onto the ground and looked at the platform. It was a 50-yard sprint across open ground. The drones had overlapping fields of fire. The moment they stepped out of the mud and into the floodlights, their thermal camouflage would be useless. "We can't make that O'Connor a cadet to Arthur's right," whispered. His teeth were chattering so hard the words barely made it out. "It's a firing squad." Arthur didn't argue. He watched the pacing of the machines. They were perfect calculating and entirely lacking in hesitation. You couldn't outrun them. You couldn't outsmart their ballistic computers in an open field. "We don't outrun them," Arthur said slowly. He reached into the mud beneath him and pulled free a heavy, jagged piece of shattered ferrocrete. He weighed it in his right hand. "We blind them." Carter looked at him, his face barely visible through the thick layer of clay. "With rocks." "With whatever you have," Arthur said. "Mud, rocks, your own boots. You don't need to destroy them. You just need to break their optic sensors for 3 seconds. That's all the time we need to cross the line." Arthur pushed himself up onto his knees. The cold air hit his wet suit, sending a violent shiver through his spine. He looked at the 4 cadets beside him. They were battered, freezing, and terrified, but the blind panic was gone, replaced by a grim, ugly desperation. "On my mark," Arthur rasped. He didn't yell. He didn't give a battle cry. He just stood up, reared back, and hurled the piece of ferrocrete at the nearest drone. "Go!" The 5 cadets exploded from the mud line. The drones swiveled instantly, their pneumatic launchers spooling up with a high-pitched whine. But Arthur's makeshift projectile flew true. The jagged concrete smashed against the leftmost drone's sensor cluster. It didn't break the glass, but the thick, wet mud clinging to the rock splattered directly across the lens. The machine stuttered its targeting algorithm, suddenly blinded. It fired wildly, the heavy paint round soaring harmlessly over Arthur's head. The cadets sprinted. Carter threw a massive handful of heavy clay at the center drone. He missed the optic, but the sheer volume of mud clogged the drone's pneumatic intake. The machine hissed its launcher, jamming as it tried to fire. They were halfway across the open ground. The rightmost drone locked onto O'Connor. A heavy round caught O'Connor perfectly in the back of the knee. The sound of the impact was sickening. O'Connor screamed, his leg buckling instantly as the blue dye exploded and locked his suit joints. He went down hard, face first, onto the grated floor of the extraction zone. Arthur didn't stop. He crossed the red line painted on the ferrocrete. He was safe. The simulation rules dictated that once in the zone, he could not be targeted, but Carter was still 10 feet out. The center drone had cleared its jam. Its launcher swiveled, locking directly onto Carter's chest. Arthur didn't think about tactical doctrine. He didn't think about his own safety. He spun around, lunging back across the red line with his one good arm. He grabbed the heavy webbing of Carter's undersuit and violently hauled him forward. The paint round shattered the air exactly where Carter had been a millisecond before. The shockwave knocked them both off their feet, sending them tumbling backward over the red line and onto the hard ferrocrete of the extraction platform. A loud, piercing klaxon echoed through the massive bay. "Exercise halted," the automated voice of the facility boomed. Instantly, the drones powered down, freezing in place. The environmental sprinklers shut off. The harsh floodlights switched to a standard neutral hum. Arthur lay on his back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling of the training bay. He couldn't breathe. His lungs were burning, his heart thrashing against his ribcage. Beside him, Carter was weeping, not out of fear, but out of sheer, overwhelming exhaustion. Footsteps echoed on the grating. Slow, deliberate. Arthur turned his head. Instructor Sullivan walked up the ramp to the extraction platform. He looked down at Arthur Carter and the two other cadets who had made it. Then he looked at O'Connor, locked in his suit a few feet away. 4 survivors. Sullivan stopped at Arthur's feet. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't smile. He looked at the mud caked over Arthur's face, the bleeding cut on his cheek, the locked, useless arm. Sloppy. Sullivan said, his voice quiet, but carrying perfectly in the silent bay. Undisciplined. You ruined a perfectly good set of training suits with unauthorized debris. Arthur slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position. He met Sullivan's gaze. He expected to feel shame. He expected to feel the sting of the reprimand. But he felt nothing but a cold, hollow clarity. Sullivan held his gaze for a long moment. The scarred instructor's synthetic fingers twitched once. But you crossed the line, Sullivan finally muttered. He turned his back on them. Report to medical to unlock your suits. Then get the mud out of your ears. You smell like the grave. Arthur watched him walk away. He looked down at his own right hand, coated in thick drying mud and flakes of rust. It wasn't shaking anymore. He squeezed his fingers into a tight, filthy fist. The illusions were entirely gone. He wasn't a hero in a Vanguard propaganda reel. He was a survivor. And he finally understood the terrifying, spiteful power of the human in the background. Antiseptic stung his nostrils, a sharp artificial chemical burn that did nothing to mask the lingering stench of trench rot. Arthur sat on the edge of the sterile metal examination table, shivering slightly, as the automated medical servos hissed, spraying a dissolving solvent onto his locked undersuit. The polymer mesh gave way with a wet crackle, releasing its vice-like grip on his left arm. Blood rushed back into the limb. It felt like 1,000 burning needles driving directly into his marrow. He gritted his teeth, refusing to make a sound, watching the sickly purple-yellow bruising already blossoming across his collarbone, where the paint round had nearly shattered it. Carter sat on the table opposite him. He looked hollowed out. A medical droid was passing a dermal regenerator over a deep scrape on Carter's cheek, but the kid wasn't blinking. He was staring at the floor tiles, his hands resting limply in his lap. They had survived, but the simulation had burned away whatever youthful bravado they had brought with them to the academy. There was no high-fiving, no adrenaline-fueled recounting of tactical maneuvers. Just the heavy, exhausted silence of cattle that had briefly escaped the slaughterhouse floor. Arthur hopped down from the table. His legs felt like lead. The medical droid beeped a mild warning about rest and hydration, which he entirely ignored. He pulled a fresh standard-issue gray fatigue shirt over his head. The fabric felt absurdly soft, almost insulting against his battered skin. He didn't wait for Carter. He walked out of the infirmary, the heavy pneumatic doors sighing shut behind him. He didn't head back to the barracks. He didn't want to see the empty bunks or answer questions from the cadets who had failed the simulation and been instantly marked for transfer. Instead, he let his boots carry him downward. Past the pristine lecture halls, past the tactical simulators, deep into the belly of the academy's infrastructure. Sector 12. Heavy maintenance. The air down here was different. It was hot thick with the smell of vaporized machine oil ozone and scorched carbon. The lighting was poor, a patchwork of amber hazard lamps and localized work lights cutting through a perpetual thin haze of exhaust smoke. Massive towering loader mechs hung suspended from reinforced gantry cranes, their armor plating stripped away to reveal complex bleeding hydraulic systems. Arthur walked slowly down the central aisle. Sparks rained down from a catwalk above, bouncing off the heavy ferrocrete floor. He didn't flinch. He found the group from the mess hall near the rear bay doors. They were gathered around the massive exposed engine block of a troop transport, arguing loudly over the rhythmic, deafening clatter of a pneumatic wrench. The older man with the silver-threaded hair was underneath the transport, lying on a wheeled creeper. Only his legs and heavy grease-stained boots were visible. Arthur stopped a few feet away. He didn't know what he was doing here. He hadn't planned a speech. He just needed to see them. He needed to anchor the violent revelation he had experienced in the mud to something real, something tangible outside of Sullivan's curated holograms. The pneumatic wrench cut off. The sudden silence was jarring. "Hand me the 3/8 driver," a voice grunted from beneath the transport. Arthur looked at the tool cart sitting next to him. He recognized the driver. He reached out with his right hand, the knuckles still raw. Dirt packed impossibly deep beneath his fingernails, picked up the heavy cold metal tool, and knelt. He slid it across the concrete floor. A grease-stained hand shot out from under the chassis and caught the tool. The man paused. He rolled out on the creeper, wiping a streak of black oil from his forehead with the back of his wrist. It was the man with the scarred arm. He looked up at Arthur. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the cadet's fresh, clean fatigues, and then stopping on the dark, spreading bruise visible at the collar line. He saw the cut on Arthur's cheek. He saw the dirt Arthur hadn't been able to entirely scrub from his knuckles. "You're out of bounds, cadet," the man said. His voice was gravelly, tired. "I know," Arthur replied. His voice was steady. It didn't tremble. The human didn't yell. He didn't demand a salute. He just sat up, resting his elbows on his knees, holding the heavy wrench. He looked at Arthur, not with the disdain of a veteran looking at a green recruit, but with that same cold, evaluating stare he had used in the mess hall. "Simulation," the human asked, nodding toward the bruise. "Sector 7, Arthur said. "Hunter-killers, unarmored." The human raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his worn features. "Sullivan ran you against heavy armor with no plating. He usually saves that meat grinder for year 2. He decided we needed to see what happens when the gear fails," Arthur said. He looked around the maintenance bay at the exposed wiring and the brutal, ugly machinery. He showed us footage from the perimeter, a breach, Goliaths. The human's expression hardened instantly. The casual fatigue vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating gravity. The air between them suddenly felt dangerous. "And what did you learn?" Arthur looked back at the man. He thought about the coalition soldiers running in terror. He thought about the human in the hologram waiting with a suicide charge and a sharpened shovel. He thought about the freezing slop of the trench and the rock he had hurled at a 500,000 credit machine. "I learned that armor is a liability if you think it makes you safe," Arthur said quietly. "I learned that when you're pushed into a corner, you don't panic. You find a rock." The older man stared at him for a long, quiet moment. The mechanical noise of the bay seemed to fade into the background. Then very slowly, the human nodded. It wasn't an explosive gesture of approval. It was a grim, heavy acknowledgement. "The galaxy is full of things that are bigger than you, faster than you, and designed specifically to tear you apart," the human said, softly. He reached down and picked up a grease rag, wiping his hands. "The coalition thinks they can out-tech them. They build thicker walls, bigger guns, but eventually the wall breaks, and when it does, the only thing that matters is who is willing to get uglier." The man tossed the rag onto the cart. He lay back down on the creeper. "Keep your fingernails dirty, kid," the human muttered from beneath the transport. "You might survive." Arthur stood up. The dull ache in his shoulder was still there, a constant throbbing reminder of his own fragility. But the crushing dread that had weighed on his chest since 0600 was gone. He turned and walked back down the aisle, the sparks from the welding torches reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't the vanguard of a shining, untouchable military force. He was a fragile, water-filled bag of meat and bone. And he was going to make them bleed for every inch. That concludes our gritty dive into the reality of sci-fi warfare. If Arthur's journey from terrified cadet to hardened survivor kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more HFY stories. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and let me know in the comments what would you do in the mud. See you in the next one.